Hello, and welcome to my weekly podcast, Through the Bible in 10 Years. Today, we are going to finish up Luke chapter 8. So last week we started Luke 8, and now we are going to do verses 26 through 52. There are two stories this week. The first is the story of the man who has a legion of demons in him. And then the second story is the story of the healing of both Jairus's daughter and the woman with a hemorrhage. We don't know her name. So let's go ahead and begin with the first story of this week, um, the Gerasene demoniac. Verse 26, and they sailed to the region of the Gerasenes, which is across the lake from Galilee. So we're now on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee. This is not friendly territory. We covered this, of course, in the Gospel of Mark. I think it's Mark 6. I can't remember, 5 or 6. Might be chapter 5. So we've already done a podcast on this story back when we first started this last year, or 2 years ago now, I guess. I can't remember when we started the podcast. I think it was early in 2018. It's been a long time. Time flies when you're having fun. But this is not really Israelite country. This is and this is completely foreign land. And I think you might even say that perhaps this country is a type of the Gentiles. It's a hint in the ministry of Jesus that the gospel is not just for the Jews, but it's for outsiders. And of course, Jesus' ministry is a ministry of including people, of bringing in people who are maybe they're in Israel, but they're on the edges of Israel. And of course, eventually, however, he will bring in the whole world and the Gentiles. That's a major theme of Luke Acts in general, although not really explicit in this story. But they're in unfamiliar territory. I don't know whether you've ever been in unfamiliar territory. I'm an interesting person, I suppose. To myself, I'm interesting. But there are people who are they want to stay in familiar territory. Um, I've always been somebody who, I did my doctoral work in England. Um, I like to travel. I spent some time in Sierra Leone, Africa. I'm the kind of person that likes new things. I also like old things too. I've eaten the same lunch now pretty much for months. So it's not that I don't that I have to have something different every time. That's not it. But I'm an adventuresome person when it comes to new places. Probably the most unfamiliar place that I have been was when we went to Hungary. And when I was in Hungary, I didn't know any of the language, and I felt a little bit out of my depth. I always like to learn a little bit of a language before I travel somewhere. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because this is not comfortable country. This is uncomfortable country. This is a place where you're not the dominant person. Now, there are people in the United States who never feel like they're the dominant person. I believe in the concept of white privilege, although it's a controversial topic. I don't know why it should be. I think I clearly have certain advantages as a white man in the United States that people who aren't white men don't have. That's a controversial thing, although to me it's a fairly obvious thing. But and so to be in a place where I'm not in the privileged position, it's disorienting. Again, I've not felt this too much. Even when I was in Africa, there was a certain privilege that a white person was given. It manifested itself in strange ways. For example, having to pay more for a taxi fare than the other people in the taxi. That doesn't sound like privilege, but it's a manifestation of a kind of privilege. But probably the closest I remember to feeling like I'm really not in comfortable territory was a brief trip to Hungary at one point where I felt completely out of my depth, and that I was completely incapable of speaking the language or doing anything. All of that is to say is This is uncomfortable territory. Jesus is in, maybe not for Jesus, but this is not normal territory. The disciples certainly are like, what are we doing here? That would have been the way it would have felt. This is not the homeland that Jesus is at. Verse 27, when Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from town. Now, we don't know what town this is. There aren't a lot of big towns in this region. In fact, the Greek is city, which suggests a larger kind of place. Anyway, we don't know where this place is. But this gentleman's probably not what we should call him at this point. For a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but had lived in the tomb. So this is a man who, one way or another, is not in his right mind. Um, we know he's not in his right mind because he's possessed of numerous demons. Verse 28, and when he saw Jesus, he cried out, he fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, what do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In Mark and here in Luke, the demons know who Jesus is. The exact identity of Jesus may not be clear to the people around him at this point, but it's clear to the spiritual forces around him. He is the Son of the Most High God. Again, we've seen this Most High God before. I think it's not in Mark, although I should double check because I can. Yes, it is in Mark chapter 5, Most High God. So this is another way of saying Son of God, of course, the King, Son of the Most High God, identifies the God of Israel as the High God, the Zeus, the Jupiter, the High God. Of course, the Jews don't believe in the other gods, but the idea of Most High God would have been something that would have communicated across cultures of the ancient world. This is the supreme God, which, of course, by the way, is the only God. But so the demons know who he is. I beg you, don't torture me, they say. Verse 29, for Jesus had commanded the impure spirit to come out of the man. Many times this demon had seized the man, and even though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places. I had an event, I can't remember if I told this story when I was doing the Mark 5 podcast, but when I was in the 6th grade, I went to a Wesleyan youth camp of all places. And there was a young man who began to have troubles. And the leaders of the camp eventually believed that he had been possessed of a demon. And perhaps he had. He manifested great strength, that young man, and was able to hold at bay a number of very large youth counselors. He just had extra strength, and of course, he was taken to help that last night of camp. It was quite a both fearsome and bizarre way to end a youth camp, for us all to be in the tabernacle praying as a young man, perhaps was either undergoing some kind of a psychological event or was in fact demon possessed. But this strength, this having of great strength, is sometimes considered a symptom of this particular kind of an incident. And Jesus says in verse 30, "What is your name?" Legion, he replied, because many demons had gone into him, multiple demons. Verse 31, and they begged Jesus repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. The abyss is a unique feature of Luke's version of this story. I assume that means hell, although it doesn't exactly say hell. Go into the abyss. Of course, we know that that is the eventual fate of demonic forces, that all the demons, we saw this in the book of Revelation, all demons will eventually find their place in the lake of fire, in the binding place. These are images of that which is beyond our understanding. But it seems to be a delay tactic on their part here. We may have to go into the abyss eventually, but please, Jesus, not yet. I'm not sure why Jesus entertains their request. This is a curious thing. Why doesn't Jesus rid the world of a few demons and send them to a place where they can't bother people anymore? I don't know. It's another one of those questions we'll have to ask the Lord when we get to the kingdom. But he does allow it. Verse 32, a large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. Another indication they're not in Israel, right? Because there would be no pigs in Israel. They have entered a different land, a foreign land, a crazy land. They're in a liminal space, if you would. A liminal space is a space that's neither here nor there. It's an in-between space. It's like the international part of an airport after you've gone through security. You're not in the country anymore, so to speak. They're somewhere else where there are pigs. Perhaps when the parable of the prodigal son is told, we might picture this land again. I don't know. That is in Luke chapter 15. And so within the story world of Luke, the only place we know where there are pigs is right here. But the demons begged Jesus to let them go into the pigs, and he gave them permission. Verse 33, when the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. Does Jesus has compassion on the pigs? This is, I mean, on the demons, which is quite interesting. I preached a sermon several months ago in which I said that God the Father even loves Satan, and that if there was any way for Satan to be redeemed, the Father would, find a way. Would the Father die? Would Jesus die? Would the Son of God die for Satan if it were possible for Satan to be saved? Given my understanding of God, I think I would have to say that if there were a way for Satan to be saved, God would see to it, which is a controversial statement, I think, but that's my understanding of the character of God. Verse 34, when those tending the pigs saw what had happened, they ran off and they reported this in the city and the countryside. By the way, I believe I'm reading from the NIV today. Unintentional, but happy NIV day. I substituted city for town there. Verse 35, and the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out. They saw the man sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. Fear. Have you noticed that there is a theme of fear in Luke? I don't know if it's more in Luke than in the other Gospels, but definitely there is this fear factor in the story that we've had in the Gospel of Luke. And why are they afraid? Because this is not normal. We like the normal, right? We like when things are predictable. This is not predictable. This is strange. They were happy with the man being in the tombs. Maybe they weren't, but it's kind of like, okay, we don't have to deal with this person. Now they have to deal with somebody who has been rescued, somebody who's been saved, somebody who's been healed. And the church doesn't always like it when people get saved, unfortunately. We like the way things are, the status quo. But now they're going to have to deal with this man who is clothed and in his right mind. Verse 36, those who'd seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured, had been healed, had been saved, sozoed. There is this play on the word sozo in the Greek, meaning to be saved, but of course it has the double meaning of being healed as well. Verse 37, then all the people of the region and the Gerasenes, they asked Jesus to leave them because they were overcome with fear. So he got into the boat and left. We know this, some people can't handle even a good thing because it's just so unfamiliar. And the people of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave. This is too peculiar for us. We like things the way they are. We don't like healing. Healing hurts, and healing can hurt. Verse 38, the man from whom the demons had gone out, he begged to go with Jesus, but Jesus sent him away, saying, 39, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went away, and he told all over town, all over the city, how much Jesus had done for him. He would be more comfortable with Jesus. This is an interesting dynamic where we would be more comfortable in one place, but God calls us to the mission. God calls us to that which is not comfortable and that which is not certain. Around Jesus, this man knows he's loved. The man will not obviously feel love necessarily in his home country or among his home people, but Jesus didn't heal him just so that he could bask in the glory of Jesus' love. Now it's his turn to see people saved, his turn to see people healed. All right, well, that's the first story, the Gerasene demoniac. I think in some manuscripts, at least of maybe Mark, it says Gadarene demoniac. I grew up on the King James, so Gadarene, I believe, is the way it's worded in the King James version. Perhaps you have a Bible that has Gadarene. So variations in the manuscripts. Okay. Verse 40. This is the story of the healing of Jairus' daughter and the woman with a hemorrhage. And it's sandwiched together. So the sandwich method, we called it intercalation in seminary. But sandwich method is you start one story, that's the bread, and you end with that story. That's the other slice of the bread. So you have story one, story two, and then story one again. So story one, the bread, is the healing of Jairus' daughter. So this story starts off with Jairus, and then we interrupt the Jairus story for a woman with a hemorrhage. And then at the end of the story, we return to Jairus' daughter, and it ends with that. And usually there's some sort of a similarity between the meat and the bread. The two stories, the interplay of the two stories in some way brings out meaning. Now, I'm not sure, I've never been entirely sure what meaning this the woman with the hemorrhage, I'm not sure what light that sheds on the Jairus' story, other than Jesus cares about everybody. Jesus cares about the marginal. Jesus cares about those who nobody else cares about. Um, um, it's a woman in both cases, of course. Jairus' daughter is woman one, and then the woman with the hemorrhage is woman two. So there is that kind of interplay between a woman who needs healed. They're both vulnerable women. The daughter, of course, has no power of her own. There's another interesting similarity is the 12 years. It's a very formal kind of similarity, but his daughter is about 12 years old, and the woman with the hemorrhage has had her flow of blood for about 12 years. So there's a 12-year commonality. Now, I wasn't the expression of 12 years in verse 43 is interesting. And in fact, I was tempted to translate it a little differently, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back and start the story and go through it. Verse 40. Now, when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him. So he's gone back to the other side of the lake, the comfortable side. They were all waiting on him. They were expecting him. Verse 40. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house. Verse 42. Because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. Okay, so there's the bread, the top bread number one, the beginning of the story. Now we interrupt that story. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. 43. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. And now there's a variation in the manuscripts. Um, Although she'd spent her money on doctors, her whole life savings on doctors. The manuscripts are very divided. I have a Greek New Testament that grades ambiguity, and it gives a D to this one. In other words, the committee really isn't sure what the original said here. There are different rules with trying to decide what the original reading of something was. One of them is, choose the best manuscripts. Well, the problem is the best manuscripts, so-called, are divided. So there is a very early manuscript, Papyrus 75, that dates from the early 200s, which is very early as manuscripts go. in general, very, very early. And it has nothing here. It simply has what the NIV has here. A woman who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. And that's what the NIV has gone with. And I think the NLT has gone with that. And no doubt other versions, I didn't look up all the versions, but many versions say, man, the earliest manuscript we have of Luke does not have that reading. And so we should go with that, with it not being there. And also, there's a codex. It's not a papyrus, it's on animal hide. It's called Codex Vaticanus. Codex Vaticanus, which dates from the early 300s. It doesn't have the line about her having spent her life savings on doctors. So we have two very early, usually considered very accurate manuscripts that do not have the statement who had spent her life savings on doctors. However, the majority of manuscripts, which isn't necessarily an indication of better, manuscripts should be weighed, not counted, is the saying. Codex Sinaiticus, which also dates from the early 300s, has the reading here. And so it's just difficult to know. There's another principle in text studies called the shorter reading is more likely the original reading. I think on the whole, I think I have to side with the NIV in not having those words there. It is hard to figure out why someone would delete those words. Why would somebody why would somebody delete those words? We could perhaps see someone adding it to add flavor to the statement. But in any case, I think I'm going to in my little world here, my little scholarliness, go with those who say that probably wasn't in the original of Luke, the statement that she'd spent her whole life savings on doctors. Although that fits with the idea of the author of Luke being Luke the physician, that he would talk about the doctor part. But I think just trying to go with the evidence and the rules as I understand them, probably I would have to agree with not putting that line into the text. So there's a woman who's been subject to a hemorrhage, to bleeding for 12 years, which of course means she is uncleanness. She is kind of permanently unclean. She's constantly unclean. Everything she comes into contact with becomes unclean. She's an unclean generator, which is a horrible, horrible state to live in. Which I think might be an overtone here of the fact that Jesus makes everything clean. Clean and unclean is an interesting concept in Jewish thinking, because on the one hand, unclean can contaminate clean, and yet Jesus is super holy. Jesus is he is the permanent cleanser. He's the uber cleanser, the omni cleanser. When this woman touches Jesus, bam, she's clean. With Jesus, it goes the other way. Nothing makes Jesus unclean. He only cleanses things. That's pretty neat. So anyway, she came up behind him, verse 44, touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stood still. I love the Greek here. Has stopped, has stood. Her bleeding immediately stops when she touches Jesus. He doesn't even think about it. It's her faith, of course, but man, verse 45, who touched me? You know that song, oh, he touched me, and oh, the joy that floods my soul. Anyway, Jesus says, who touched me? Now they all denied it. I didn't touch you. Of course, everybody's touching Jesus. Peter said, Master, people are thronging and crowding and pressing against you. Mark, of course, goes on here to say, and you're asking me who touched. Now, Luke does not seem to have that statement. He's edited that out, where Peter gets a little attitude and says, why are you saying who's touching you? Everybody's touching you. Luke doesn't tell that part. 46. I appreciate it when people don't tell my stupid comments to others. 46. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. Again, slightly different in Luke. In Mark, he says, who touched me again? Verse 47. It's interesting that Jesus doesn't seem to know. And I've said this over and over again. The Gospels do not, they just don't, at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, do not portray Jesus as omniscient while he was on earth. Now, theologically, I don't believe Jesus can empty himself of his omniscience. He can't become not omniscient in theology because he's the second person of the Trinity. And so I usually say he has chosen not to access his omniscience. He's put it in a lockbox that Jesus did not function with omniscience as a human on earth. He had his omniscience somewhere in his divinity. It's not, he can't lose it, but he did not access it. Jesus did not operate with omniscience while he was on earth. He genuinely doesn't know at this point, it seems, who has touched him. Verse 47. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, she came trembling, fell at his feet, and in the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." That's interesting. Jesus doesn't force people to be healed. People can be healed if they have faith in Jesus. Our faith is part of it. God has, in his wisdom, enabled us to participate in what happens in the world. He allows us to pray, and I believe that God responds in accordance with our prayers. I believe that there are times where if we had prayed, God would have done something. But because we didn't pray, God didn't do something. Or there are times where we did pray and God did something that he wouldn't have done if we hadn't prayed. God lets us participate in his decision making. This is part of him giving freedom to his creation. And he gave freedom to this woman whose faith has saved her, has healed her. Again, the word sozo in verse 48. Okay, so we've had the bread one, sandwich meat, now back to bread one, or to bread, the other bread, bread two, the bottom part of the bread, back to Jairus's daughter. 49. While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," he said. "Don't bother the teacher anymore." That statement, "don't bother the teacher," we also heard that with the story of the centurion earlier. Verse 50, hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just believe, just have faith, and she will be saved, or we will be healed." Man, I love it when God says that to somebody. Don't be afraid, just believe. You know something good's about to happen then. Sometimes it's not God's will to heal. Sometimes it's not God's will to rescue. It's always God's will to save, I think. But what a word from the Lord. Don't be afraid, just believe. 51. When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. That's an addition here in Luke, the child's father and mother. So the inner circle is going to witness this. Verse 52. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. "Stop wailing," Jesus said. "She is not dead, but asleep." Now that's not believable. Although it bothers me their response. Verse 53, they laughed at him knowing she was dead. I don't know about you. I wouldn't laugh. If I had a loved one who died and someone comes in and says, this person's not dead, they're only sleeping, I would not laugh. To me, it calls into question the sincerity of those who are weeping and wailing. It's almost like they're going through the motions. Well, it's expected. I was at a funeral once where I felt like some of the people there felt like, well, if we don't get blessed at this funeral, then we're dishonoring the person who's died. I felt like they kind of worked up a blessing, worked up the Holy Spirit because, well, that's what we should do here to show that this person was a godly person. It felt fake to me, to be honest. Now, maybe I'm judging them. And so, Lord, forgive me if I'm judging them. But these individuals were weeping and wailing, and then they laugh. I don't know about you. I think I would be more I would be more apt to be angry at somebody who said, this person's not dead, they're just sleeping. There's something peculiar to me about the laughter of these individuals. And of course, if you had faith, you would have hope. I mean, it's kind of like, well, I really don't believe you, but I want to believe you. That seems to me that would be a more appropriate response even then. But this is Jesus. Verse 54, he took her by the hand and he said, "My child, get up." And of course, in Mark's gospel, we have the Aramaic here, Talitha Kumi. One of the arguments that Mark is more original or earlier in the process of sources, Talitha Kumi in Mark. But in Luke, "My child, get up." Verse 55, her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Life's not over. Time to get on with life. Let's get some food here. Verse 56, her parents were astonished, but he ordered them not to tell anybody who had happened. That's a carryover from um, the Messianic secret in Mark. And so there you have the story of two healings, Jairus' daughter and the woman who had a hemorrhage, both of them on the margins of society. But what is one of the themes of Jesus and his mission is that Jesus cares about everyone, and Jesus cares about those who are on the margins. Well, this has been another week of Through the Bible in 10 years.